And I'm going to give you a sort of lay of the land about the watershed, the organizational structure, and then the planning that went into this project that ultimately ended up with choosing infiltration trenches as BMPs. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to talk about design, MS4 credits for this project, or pollution reduction plan credits, and maintenance, and then I'll come back and talk about the funding and what we're going to do in the future. This is Valley Creek. Valley Creek is about a 23 square mile watershed that runs through Valley Forge Park. Valley Forge Park is at the end in this section. This is the main stem of Valley Creek, and then Little Valley Creek coming along here. We're going to be talking a lot about this tributary of Crabby Creek, which is down in the southeast portion of the quadrant. This is the Paoli train yard that generated the PCBs that contaminated Valley Creek over decades. And the bottom of this watershed is underlain with limestone, and then on the hillsides, the north and south hills are more schistose formations. And as you can see, there's a lot of these represent impervious surface, and this map is old. There's about 24% of the watershed is now impervious surface. And for Crabby Creek, it's about 35%. And of that 35%, about 55% of that are roadways. It's a largely residential neighborhood with a lot of driveways and roofs, but also the properties are a little bit larger, so they're spread out with roads connecting them all. And of course, the big roads, I could tell you more about 202 and the Turnpike, but that's not part of the presentation. There's a volunteer group that we call the Valley Creek Restoration Partnership that manages stormwater management. When we first organized in about 2003, we decided that the top three priorities in the watershed were stormwater management, stormwater management, stormwater management. And we formed an unincorporated group. We do not have any paid staff. We have no staff. We have no bank account. We have no office. We have 5 environmental groups that serve as the core decision-making structure. And then we have about 12 organizations that serve as an advisory body. There's a couple of 2 townships, 2 county agencies, the Conservation District and the Water Resources Authority. We have 3 or 4 universities that have been involved over the years, and 2 federal agencies, 2 state agencies. They all, at different times, participate in the meetings and give us advice. And we go after grants to do stormwater management projects. And whoever, it's not always the same agency or environmental group that'll apply for a loan. It depends, or a grant rather. It depends upon the size of the grant. So in Valley Creek, there are 31 tributaries to Little Valley and Big Valley. And we wanted to choose one of the tributaries to sort of do a model approach to stormwater management, which would have us doing controls in the upper part of the headwaters of that tributary, working on down, and including both stream restoration as well as BMPs and infiltration projects. Sedimentation is the major reason why there's Crabby Creek is a red stream, and why a lot of tributaries in Valley Creek are on the 301D list. 303, 301, 303, 303. Okay. And I've already mentioned the impervious nature of Little Valley or Valley Creek and Crabby Creek. Valley Creek is also an exceptional value stream and a Class A fishery, largely brown trout. We focused on Crabby Creek for several reasons. One is that it has historically held brook trout in the upper regions, but nobody has seen brook trout since the Hurricane Floyd came through in 1999. And we did do one project to put about 50 brook trout back in the upper part. But the bottom part has always been known as a good spawning stream for brown trout. There's this very steep gradient from top to bottom, going south to north in Crabby Creek. And that presented its own challenges for restoration as well as best management practices. When we first started surveying or walking Crabby Creek, one of the first things we found was a head cut that was about 6 feet tall. A head cut is where there's all of a sudden a change in elevation of the stream, and a waterfall is created. And that head cut was moving back, and it was moving back at a rate of many feet per year. We have pictures of the head cut that were taken in the early part of the year, and up in the back you could see a manhole, part of the sewer line manhole, and at the end of the year that head cut was back and exposing the sewer line. We applied to the William Penn Foundation. This was before they restructured their granting process. We applied to them, and we got a study, a grant to study, and this was done by Land Studies, folks out in Lidditz. And they did some of the basic data that showed how the impervious surfaces were distributed and so forth. Out of that work, we made the commitment to do stream restoration near the bottom of Crabby Creek, and then install BMPs in the upper part of Crabby Creek.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You decided to do what?
Concentrate on both, do some stream restoration, actual in-stream restoration to try to reduce sediment loads. And then we also decided to, in the upstream area, to put in some best management practices to try to infiltrate stormwater.
The head cut you're talking about is a result of stormwater runoff dropping in and eroding it back?
Well, it turns out to be, it's a little complicated an answer, but when the township put in the sewer line, they put a road, a bridge over Crabby Creek as it existed then. And the culverts were too small. So the culverts got blocked up, and the stream started to back up in each storm. And it backed up a couple hundred yards, and it reached a tipping point where the stream then started to go east. And over that area, it was all highly erodible soils. And we don't know, we haven't calculated the number of tons of soil, but it was just ripping through highly erodible soil. This is Crabby Creek. The orange is the outline of the watershed. The blue represents the streams. You can see how there are tributaries coming up here, sub-tributaries, second order, third order streams. up here, you can see these roadways and all the houses. So the stream is cut down a lot, and these housing developments are on higher ground. And these were mostly built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, when there was no requirement to do any post-construction volume requirements on stormwater. So they're essentially uncontrolled lots. And as part of this William Penn study, the partnership hired the firm that Dan was with at the time, Cahill Associates, out of Westchester, to ask them to see what we could do in the way of best management practices. And they came back, and one of the things they showed us was that, and this is the same stream outlined, they showed us that all these little dots in here are stormwater inlets on the streets. And this is part of the infrastructure of Crabby Creek that drains the water away from the properties and from the streets and puts the water into outfalls that go into these various tributaries. And there are 22 of these. And each one of them represents a potential opportunity to control stormwater, because it's where the stormwater accumulates, and it's at a point of discharge. And so what the trenches do, and Dan's going to go into a lot of the detail on the trenches, is the trenches are built into the ground up from the low point where the sewer inlet is. And they intercept the stormwater that's coming down the street and from drainage areas. So we've worked on 5 of these, or 4 of these sewer outfalls, and there's still a lot more that we can work on in this whole Crabby neighborhood. And one of the things that, I'm backing up a little bit now. So under the William Penn Foundation grant, we did restore about 1,300 feet of stream at the bottom of Crabby Creek. And then we designed, through Dan's work, the 5 infiltration trenches for these older neighborhoods. We had one system installed in 2010 and the other just this past year in 2018. These are the locations. They involve the 4 trenches drained into 3 outfalls, and all of these outfalls drain into this parkland owned by Tredyffrin Township. This is called Crabby Creek Park. And here is, we'll be using names of streets. This is Hilltop, this is Friendship, this is Daleview, and this is Robbins. And at the low point of Robbins, for example, there's an outfall here that drains into this tributary of Crabby Creek. And there was a trench put in there. And this is the drainage area for that trench. On Daleview, similar thing. This is the drainage area, the outfall here going down into Crabby Creek. And then over here, two of the sewer lines, storm sewer lines, actually join together and went into one outfall up in this area. Now, one very important part of this whole project is the infiltration trenches were put in the township rights of way on these streets. And I didn't know this until we started on this project. Each township, and now, right now I'm referring to Tredyffrin Township. We worked with Steve Burgo, their township engineer. They have rights of way that go up onto the property of the homeowners. And they can install different things in those rights of way which they have the easement to. So Steve wrote back to me and said, when I asked him more about rights of way and whether every township has them or not, is that they have a legal right of way in ROW associated with the roadway. The biggest variation, though, is the width of any particular right of way. Sometimes that right of way can be small and limited to about 22 or 24 feet. Most of the time it falls around 33 feet or 50 feet with larger rights of way for state roadways. Every municipality is different and every road is too. So the reason I bring this up is we sometimes talk about the transferability of this infiltration trench technology to other townships and other watershed associations, and a lot of it will depend on that, how that right-of-way is built into the code of the township. Okay, now I think Dan is up.
These photos are just to give you an idea of what the neighborhood looks like. It's an older residential neighborhood, a lot of mature trees, as you can see, a lot of topography, a lot of slopes to deal with. We were fortunate to have some space, as Chuck mentioned, within the right-of-way to implement these trenches. And what was really important was that these spaces were relatively flat. So we had a stretch of relatively flat land, whether in the streets themselves or just behind the curb line, still right-of-way, but in the grass strips. So on the left, you can see Hilltop and then Friendship Drive on the right. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the design at those locations.
Does Soares represent the dots, the original dots on the map?
I believe so, yes. So some of the design objectives, the design goals, Chuck kind of alluded to some of these. Really the main one was to intercept runoff from the streets. And obviously there's runoff that's coming from driveways and homes as well. Yards, backyards, front yards. Capture it before it discharges and continues to erode at these stormwater outfalls. Reduce stormwater volume. So we're capturing it in these trenches. We're hopefully infiltrating it, increasing groundwater recharge, and reducing the volume and the peak rate of that runoff before it leaves the site. And also, we want to improve runoff quality. So there's a couple mechanisms to improve runoff quality in these trenches, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We're reducing the volume, so that means there's less discharging, that means there's less erosion, less sedimentation getting carried downstream. Anything that doesn't infiltrate, that still leaves these trenches, is getting filtered to some extent. Just the process of flowing through the aggregate and the other materials that are in these trenches. And this is probably hard for everyone to read. I thought it was important. So this is the exact template for a sign, an educational sign that we developed with Chuck's input that was meant to be installed at one of the sites. Chuck tells me today that it hasn't yet been installed. The homeowner, I think, balked a little bit when he realized, I guess, the size of the footings required for this thing. It's fairly big and fairly hefty. But in any case, this was developed to really provide the public with some information, some educational information about the nature of stormwater trenches, what they are, why we're doing them, what they're made of. So that's the purpose of this. I thought it was good to just show you what that looked like, and we can just touch on some of the points included here. We'll get to the schematic on the right side in a minute. I have a blow-up of that. I think a lot of this we've already kind of covered. You know, this talks about what is an infiltration trench. Really very simple. It's a system that's designed to hold stormwater temporarily and then let it percolate into the ground. What doesn't percolate will kind of bleed out back into the existing storm sewers and out into the outfalls, as it currently does, but at a greatly reduced rate. Why are they in this neighborhood? I think, again, Chuck kind of talked about that. These were locations where we had outfalls that were causing erosion for many, many years and looked like good opportunities. Earlier on, I don't know if Chuck remembers this or not, but earlier on in the project, we designed these infiltration trenches at the street, so where closer to the source of the runoff. And then we also had designed a series of stabilization measures at the outfalls. Those stabilization measures, they were things like infiltration berms, level spreaders. So what we couldn't capture, what we couldn't infiltrate into the ground, and that would still outfall, would now get distributed along the slope rather than just blasting out down into the existing eroded channels. But the problem with those measures, I think a couple things. I think budget was one concern. The other concern was really just constructability, how to actually get a crew to those outfall locations, to those sloped areas to install these measures. So it was a bit impractical. We'd have to work with the homeowners. There would probably be damage to existing vegetation, existing trees. Definitely wasn't desired by anyone. So those ended up getting value engineered out of the project. So moving over to the schematic, really the one thing to point out is you can just drive right past these trenches. You wouldn't even know they're there. They're not, exactly the most exciting of stormwater retrofits. There's nothing overtly green that you're going to see about these. They're not bioswales or rain gardens. So everything's underground. So as Chuck mentioned, the way these work, very simple. They have an inlet or a series of inlets that capture runoff. They let that runoff, they direct that runoff into a pipe in a lot of cases that then connects to a series of modular tanks. So these are kind of like big milk crates, if you will. They're designed with loading in mind. You can drive trucks over this without it having any kind of structural issues. So the inlet goes to a pipe. The pipe goes to a plastic storage unit. The water fills that up. And really the beauty of these things is that they're almost entirely open space. So they're about 95% void space. So most of that volume is readily usable storage volume for runoff. So those spaces fill up. Water starts to bleed. You don't see this. There's stone on the sides of these things. So there'd be stone that goes from here to the top. So the water would fill up these milk crates and then kind of bleed into a stone sandwich or a stone envelope. And all of that, the stone and the plastic units together give us the storage volume. And then, this will be easier to show you in the next series of schematics, but we have another structure that controls the water in these systems and allows extreme events to just discharge. I covered pretty much everything. There's geogrids, there's other kinds of fabrics that we use. We do like to wrap our systems in a non-woven geotextile. We want to try to preserve the storage capacity of these systems and not let there be kind of intrusion of soil, migration of soil from around the trench.
So is that a picture of it installed?
That is,
I believe that's a before. Okay. Yeah, that's a before. So
it's actually a tank underground.
It's a series of tanks underground surrounded by stone. And so the reason why it's not all stone, I should kind of back up a little bit. So we were really trying to get as much water in the ground in these fairly limited locations as we could. We only had so much distance with relatively flat land to work with. Of course, we only have so much right-of-way to work with. There's utilities that you don't see here. There's water, there's gas. So there's obviously other things going on. This is a retrofit situation. And when you're working with a retrofit situation, you're limited. not as limited as we are in a lot of our other projects, which are much more urban. So we did have some room to work with, but to really try to make a big dent in these areas, we actually, to be honest, we need a lot more storage than what we even ended up with on these projects. But it was something. So since we had such limited space, we went with a product like this, which gave us a lot more storage for the square footage, if you will.
And did you say that underground unit is attached to a store line that goes to an outfall?
Yes, this will be more apparent. Actually, I'm going to skip that for now. It's going to be hard to read everything. This is just to kind of give you guys a sense of what these projects look like. So existing conditions, they were really, I believe in this case, so this is Friendship Drive. And in this case, there were inlets, I think a double inlet here, and I believe an inlet on that side as well. So really everything would go to those inlets and then into a pipe, and that pipe would just run and outfall and into an eroded channel. So what we were doing was we were putting in these blue squares here, new inlets. So new inlet, and then two on that side. Those would catch the water first, put it into these milk crates, let the storage fill up, and then eventually at this particular site, we kept the existing inlets in place, somewhat of a cost savings measure. There's existing infrastructure and it's in decent shape. We'll try to reuse it. So in this particular case, we left those inlets in place and we installed a weir inside of it. So now that weir helps us to control the water in the system, so the water doesn't just flow right out. It's now going to fill up to the top of that weir, spill over in extreme events, and discharge out the existing pipes.
So did you design it so that the water goes into the 4 new areas first and then the existing one? Or like, is there a priority of structuring it?
So the water, so before the water just would have come down the street. So this is the low point. So the water would be coming down, kind of meeting here, going into these existing inlets and then going out. Under this design, so the water's coming down and now goes into this inlet. So the street's crowned, of course. So we're getting this side of the street, all that runoff that's coming around is going into that. This runoff from here is going into that inlet. And then on the other side of the street, it's going into those 2 inlets. And then so these 2 inlets here, they feed right into the system. These 2 inlets required us to design new storm sewers that would cross back over, connect into the system. And so everything has to come into this trench, and then it goes back into the existing pipe.
So that gridded area, that's the entire trench, so that's pretty long.
That is pretty long, yes. Yes. Well, so these, I believe these are the original numbers. So they changed over the course of the design. They changed a bit from this. If anything, they went down. Everything kind of went down. Once we got really into the nuts and bolts of the design, we realized what our limitations were. You know, we got a land survey. We saw where the utilities were. The topography, we had a better sense of that. So you can get a sense of the total lengths of these and the depths as well and the widths, but they're not exact.
So how were the crates cleaned, and then who was responsible for the maintenance?
We'll get to maintenance. That's a really good question. But yeah, the grid that you see, that's what the milk crates look like kind of in plan view. They do need, again, side stone. They need some side support, if you will. Now this one in particular, so this line here is the curb line. And so at this site, the trench is behind the curb line in the grass, and it's actually set back a few feet from the curb line because there was a gas line. There's a gas line that runs right between the curb and where our trench was. So we had to, that was definitely an issue. We obviously had our survey, which depicted a certain location, and then you do one call, of course, and you get them to mark out the location. But there was, since this project extended for a number of years, there were some discrepancies. There were discrepancies with one call markouts. You know, one At one point, it was shown at a certain distance from the curb, and later on, it was then shown at a different. So we had to make some adjustments to our design based on that. I don't believe they ran into any issues during construction with that, so that was a good thing. So I don't know if there's anything else on this one. I mentioned the existing inlet. We use that as our overflow structure.
So this trench is between the home proper and the curb.
Correct.
Okay. So I take it these homes do not have sewer lines, municipal sewer lines, or you mentioned a gas line, or they're not getting a gas service line.
They do, and in general, we try to avoid those laterals.
Okay, so you take that into consideration before you pick a site.
Correct. Well, it's more of a design consideration. Once we have that information for design, we try to. The ideal thing is to avoid having those laterals run through a trench. Obviously, there's issues. I mean, it's not impossible. We can do that. We can protect the laterals, but it's just easier to just keep them separate, I think, if we can.
Are you going to address the issue of negotiating this with the homeowners, or, I know that the township has a legal right-of-way, that's one thing, but then not really annoying homeowners or, getting their cooperation, if that was an issue.
Chuck may be in a better position to talk about that. I know there was definitely coordination with the homeowners. I think,
For each project, I'll try to speak loud enough.
Okay.
For each project, there was discussion between the township and the homeowners. There was notification to the homeowners of what was intended, and by and large, well, first, in a project like this, you can see there are property lines as part of the survey. So there were maybe 4 homes, 4 property owners involved on an average on each project. There was only one instance where on the first day of construction, on the project that was done in 2011, where the homeowner actually brought his attorney down out that morning when they were going to start, and there was discussion, but that was solved and without exchange of money or anything. So by and large, there was pretty good acceptance of these projects.
So just on the same topic, when you showed that initial design, you showed it in the streetway. That would not be an issue because it's outside the curb. This is still in the right-of-way, but the homeowners see that differently. So that's now you're into my space.
Right, that's right.
Even though
Yeah.
you have the legal right-of-way, so that's why you had it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And under the terms of the contract there's a company called, in the last 4 trench projects, the company was called Reamstown Excavating that got the contract. And they had to restore everything to grade and seed. Carol?
Chuck, could you say something about what were some of the issues that homeowners presented? What are their concerns about projects like this?
That one property owner was the only one who vocalized the concern. The only other one, and I don't know what the specifics of that were. The only other owner was concerned that the stormwater problem that existed there, the flow that went into the sewer before the project was even started, was pretty heavy volume, and there's still volume there even after the project. So he was hoping for a little bit more.
Okay, thank you.
I was just curious, I don't know what you call it, like an infiltration field, or how many feet away from that trench does the water seep out underground?
Well, that's a good question. So it's not really an easy answer, I think, to that. It depends on the underlying soil conditions, bedrock. We really did not do any extensive geotechnical investigations on this type of project. We assumed that it would infiltrate. During construction, if we saw anything that would lead us to believe that there was a problem, then we knew we would have to make some design changes. It didn't really come up. We do have, I believe, we have small weep holes in the weirs in the control structure. So worst case, if we don't have good permeability, that the water won't just sit there. It will drain out slowly and back into the sewer. But really, we're far enough from homes, I think, to have any kind of adverse impacts. Generally, so the trenches, I think for the most part, except for actually Hilltop, we're on the uphill side of the street. So we're that much further from the homes on the other side that are downhill, and we're downhill from the closer home on that side of the street. Is there a question?
Sure. So could you say relatively, old versus new, the infiltration setup that you have in that area, say for areas that have characteristics of sinkholes or subsidence, sedimentary bedrock, could you make the argument that just relatively, this new infiltration system would be better than an impermeable surface that might have been there before?
Well, we'd like to think that would be the case. Sure. I mean, we're not really replicating natural conditions. Obviously, we're still at the end of the day trying to, put a Band-Aid on the situation, trying to retrofit something. Ideally, we would have a whole bunch of distributed, smaller rain gardens, trenches all throughout these neighborhoods. We're really just trying to work in the areas that we can work in, those right-of-ways, those low points, where we have some flat ground. So we're trying to get to at least, in some measure, back to more, existing conditions, if you will. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, if you didn't know infiltration rates, how did you determine volume control?
So volume control is really just dead storage, just how much storage we are providing. So we're not really factoring in how much water is leaving during a storm event or after a storm event. So it's really just how much storage volume do we have, that dead space.
So trying to relate this to MS4 and
Sure.
permitting and how a township might consider this as one of the BMPs to, implement to achieve their MS4 requirements. Is this an accepted BMP, and how would you calculate, is there a formula for this that the DEP puts out that you could be able to specify what it's done, like in reduction of sedimentation?
Yeah, the answer is yes and yes. We'll talk about that in a minute. We have a slide on our MS4 credits for this project. But yeah, it's definitely something within the realm of what's acceptable for MS4 credit. So this is Hilltop Road. So this is actually downstream from the Friendship Drive location. I believe the discharge pipe from Friendship actually comes down the hill and connects into an inlet here, crosses the road, and the outfall is actually down a bit that way to the right. So this location, very, very limited. We really had a short stretch where it was relatively flat. So here, to try to get as much storage as we could in this fairly small space, we split it into two trenches, one on either side of the street, but really the same concept. So you can see the larger trench is on the left side. We put two inlets here. This inlet crosses the street and comes into here. So really all the runoff that's coming down the street from here, from the south, is all flowing through the larger of the two trenches. We have a control here with a weir, crosses back over, fills up another trench, and then from there it'll connect back into an existing inlet and out. So a little bit of a different scenario on that one. I did want to mention one thing I forgot on this. We did have some slope to deal with here. This wasn't completely flat. If you have an eagle eye, you can see these represent contours, 1-foot contours. So there is slope coming down. And when we build an infiltration trench, we don't want the bottom of it to be sloping. We want it to be flat. So we created kind of a series of steps in this trench. And at each step, I think that's an example, we put a liner, which would act as like a weir. So it would help fill up that uppermost step and then have it kind of cascade down.
I'm going to continue the presentation by talking about project cost. and also how these projects were funded, who the managers were, and do some analysis of cost effectiveness. The next slide shows the 4 individual trenches and the cost of each one. The largest was the Daleview project, which cost $163,000. The smallest was Hilltop at $47,000. The Robbins and Friendship projects were around the same level. You have to remember that the Robbins project was done in 2011, so those are 2011 costs, whereas the other 3 projects are 2018 costs. Regarding the sources of funding, this chart shows when the project was completed, who the manager was, and in the first case of Robbins, Tredifrin was the grant recipient, and they also managed the entire project. And then for the other 3 projects, Valley Forge Trout Unlimited obtained the grants and did the management of the project. Tredifrin Township managed the bidding and construction oversight of all of the projects. In the case of Robbins and Friendship and Daleview, the source of funds was the Growing Greener, DEP's Growing Greener program. And for each grant, a match is required, and in all cases for these projects, the Valley Creek Trustee Council, VCTC, was the matching grantor. The Schuylkill River Greenways also was a grantor for the Hillside project. One of the other things that I like to do in these kinds of projects is look at cost effectiveness, and that is the amount of cost per unit of stormwater managed. One of the reasons I did it here was because when you look at the initial numbers for these grants and you see them total over $400,000, you think that's quite a bit of money, and what kind of effectiveness do you get out of such an expenditure? And then in this case, I also related it to the use of rain gardens in neighborhoods, which would be another choice of reducing stormwater. Or you could also do both of them, because you could do rain gardens on people's properties to control what enters the streets, and then use the trenches to control what enters the streets from all sources and then gets managed. So in this case, the trenches show what looks to be a high cost effectiveness relative to rain gardens of $2.90 per gallon. The rain gardens were at $2 per gallon. So it sort of looks like it gives the edge to rain gardens. But another factor that has to be taken into account is the useful life of these projects. Trenches will last 20 to 30 years at least, and whereas rain gardens have a more limited life, and it's quite likely that you'll have to replace a rain garden or completely refurbish it at least once or twice during that lifetime. So if you refurbish it twice and spend $5,000 each time, or even a little less, you'll be increasing the cost up to around $4 per gallon. So I think the trenches can play a considerable role in a neighborhood's stormwater management program. One of the things we're looking at now is what we do in the future on Crabby Creek. And we have Jacob's looking into this. There are, we know that Maple and Birch Lanes are 2 other neighborhoods where there are stormwater inlets that could be candidates for infiltration trench programs. We've already had an indication from Tredyffrin Township that they're willing to manage projects again. And Valley Forge Trout Unlimited is willing to apply for grants and manage the financial aspects of the project. And these projects appear to be technically feasible. So we do have all the right candidates. And as the next picture shows, the stars are where the 4 projects were done of Daleview, Friendship, Hilltop, and Robbins. The dotted outlined areas represent potential new trench projects. Jacobs Engineering has done some desktop type of analysis of aerial photographs and slopes and runoff and types of development. And we have a proposal from them to look at these 4 trench areas. And we will be looking at those and talking with the township about how to prioritize those.